Imagine this scenario. The United States government gets intelligence information that an attack from China is inevitable, and that the longer we wait, the more the threat will grow. Now imagine, upon hearing this information, the US government sat back, shrugged their shoulders, and did nothing. In reality, we know that this would never happen. The reason is because of one fundamental principle. If the people are under a threat, it's the government's job to protect. It is because of this same principle that I stand with the resolution today, that resolved preventive war is ethical. Let's first go over one key definition in order to have clarity in today's debate round, and that is that of preventive war. The Dictionary of Military and Associated Terms from the United States Department of Defense says it's a war initiated in the belief that military conflict, while not imminent, is inevitable, and that delay would involve greater risk. Essentially, preventive war says that when a government sees an inevitable threat where waiting to act would put the people in greater danger, the government should act in order to prevent future harm. With this definition in place, the value or weighing mechanism I believe we should use for this round is that of protection of citizens. I have one main reason to prefer this value, and that is ethical requirement. If our government decided that it just wouldn't protect its people this year, everyone would protest. Why? Because it's the moral obligation and the absolute ethical requirement of a government to protect its people. As citizens, we give certain rights to our government, and as such, we expect our government to protect our rights and us in return. To do anything less would be to violate the fundamental purpose and reason as to why we have a government in the first place. Therefore, something such as preventive war cannot be ethical unless it protects citizens. Using the value of protection of citizens means that at the end of the round, if the negative can prove that preventive war does not protect citizens, the negative should win. However, if the affirmative proves that preventive war does protect citizens, then the affirmative should win. There is one main reason, a main point as to why preventive war is ethical, and that is preventive war protects citizens. The definition of preventive war is acting in the face of an inevitable and growing threat. While it is a future threat, it is still vital that the government takes action. We can see this clearly in my application, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Allison Graham, who's a professor of government at Harvard University, wrote, "In October 1962, a U.S. spy plane caught the Soviet Union attempting to sneak nuclear-tipped missiles into Cuba, 90 miles off the U.S. coast. Kennedy determined at the outset that this could not stand. After a week of secret deliberations with his most trusted advisors, he announced the discovery to the world and imposed a naval blockade on further shipments of armaments to Cuba." Unquote. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, President Kennedy was not 100% certain that the Soviets were going to use those missiles to attack the United States. The threat that the Soviets posed was possibly far in the future. However, that didn't make taking action any less ethical. In fact, it made taking immediate action all the more necessary. Benjamin Schwartz, an MA in history from Yale, explains what President Kennedy chose to do when he wrote that, quote, "The president ordered a blockade on Cuba, an act of war," unquote. Taking action against the Soviets at that time prevented them from placing missiles in Cuba and potentially using them in the future to harm the United States. It was not ethically necessary for Kennedy to wait until the missiles were about to be launched against the United States in order to take action. No, it was ethical for Kennedy to take action then, to prevent the Soviets from being able to harm the citizens in the future. And my second point is that war is changing. War is changing. We live in an era of nuclear missiles and chemical weapons. Weapons that can destroy more than they've ever been able to in the past, and ones that can destroy quicker than they've ever been able to in the past. The Center for Contemporary Conflicts Strategic Insights, in an article entitled "Countering Asymmetrical Warfare in the 21st Century" by David E. Long, says in June 2008, "It has become increasingly clear since the turning of the 21st century that asymmetrical conflicts have evolved into a major national and international security threat. Therefore, it is to reduce The most realistic goal, therefore, is to reduce the threat level to a level that can enable societies to live normal lives free from fear and intimidation. War is very different from what it used to be in the past, and citizens are in significantly more danger from threats that are possibly far off than they were at any time in history. Preventive war acts when it sees an enemy is inevitably going to become bigger, when it's clear that the potential harm to citizens is going to increase with the amount of time that we wait. Waiting and watching the threat grow does not protect citizens. Rather, taking action and preventing the threats protects citizens. In order to fulfill what our government was created for, in order to meet the ethical requirements of what it means to be a country, in order to protect our nation, and most importantly, our citizens, it is vital that we not only choose the affirmative side of the resolution, but that we choose to stand with preventive war. Thank you.
Now the judges are all set, as well as Koryn.
Yes.
I'm going to go ahead and get right to it. Congratulations on making it to semifinals, Koryn.
Thank you.
Just have a couple questions for you. First, when you talked about in your introduction about the U.S. government, had they had certain intel in the war, should they have acted upon it? Is that right?
I'm sorry, what war are we talking about?
No, like the quote that you brought up, like the hypothetical scenario.
Oh, the hypothetical scenario. Can you give me the question again? I'm sorry.
Is it your contention that you stated should the U.S. have done like what they were going to do with certain intel? They had certain intel of the attack from the enemy.
I'm sorry, I don't really understand the question. In
Okay,
this scenario,
it's fine. Let's just go over your definition of preventive war. Can we agree that it is a war initiated in the belief?
It is a war initiating the belief that military conflict, while not imminent, is inevitable.
Okay, so there's a certain degree of speculation involved in preventive war.
Well, nothing is certain until it's already happened.
Okay, as the government actor, which, who's the actor in preventive war?
Governments. Only governments can go to war.
Okay, just wanted to clarify that. So, is there a quantifiable amount of speculation or percentage that governments can calculate when waging preventive war?
No.
Okay, so it's just right there in the blue. It's either more likely to succeed, less likely to succeed, more likely that the threat would materialize. There's not really a number, correct?
There's not a number, but it is a war. Again, it's a government is initiating this war in the belief that their citizens are in danger.
Okay, then you talked about the protection of citizens. Just making sure that every citizen is safe, correct?
Well, yes, as many citizens as is possible.
Okay, then you talked about how a negative ballot can be warranted. Could you restate that again?
A negative ballot can be warranted if it's proved that preventive war does not protect citizens.
Okay, and when we mean doesn't protect citizens, do we mean doesn't protect citizens forever, doesn't protect citizens in the current moment, or both?
I believe it would be, to me, what would be fair is if the negative can prove that citizens are protected more often, or not protected more often than not.
Okay, and we can agree that preventive war is a type of war, correct?
Yes.
Okay, and are wars violent?
Yes, inherently they are.
Okay, and whenever someone or a country makes an act of violence against another country, what is typically the response?
Typically the response is some sort of act in response to that.
Okay, so could we categorize that as revenge perhaps, like a revenge attack?
No, not necessarily. I think it depends. Revenge has something to do with what the intentions of the actor are.
Okay, then when you talked about in the missile Cuban crisis, were the missiles already sent or they weren't sent yet?
They were not sent yet. No.
Okay, and was there any guarantee that the threat would materialize?
There was no 100% guarantee. Again, 100% guarantee cannot come until something happens. But the Soviets were at odds with the United States, and the fact that they were putting missiles in our backyard seemed to signify that there was some sort of threat.
Okay, thank you, Koryn. If my panel is all set, as well as Koryn,
Yes.
I'm going to go ahead and get right into it. Quote, violence is not completely fatal until it ceases to disturb us. End quote, Thomas Merton. And this quote from writer Thomas Merton advocates what I's the negative stand for in today's debate round. Now, with an affirmative ballot, this might become a startling reality. Because when we deem that preventive war is ethical, any country can use preventive war. But to start off this speech, I want to refute some of my opponent's case and bring up some arguments of my own. First, I agree to both the definition and the value. I believe that the definition of preventive war is indeed just. A I believe that it is a war initiated in the belief that military conflict, while not imminent, is inevitable. And I also agree that protection of citizens should be the utmost goal in today's debate ground. That the purpose of citizens, or the purpose of government, is to protect its citizens. But there's just a little bit of problems that we have with the case, and really with preventive war as a concept as a whole. See, the definition talks about how it is a war initiated in the belief, meaning that there is speculation within preventive war. When I asked my opponent about the speculation of preventive war and whether or not it is quantifiable, she responded that it isn't. So because of that, we can't pinpoint an exact percentage of how well or how likely preventive war will succeed. We can't have 90% or 85, but now we have rather vague phrases like it's more likely to succeed than not, or less likely to succeed than not. And because of that, it sets a dangerous precedent. I'll talk about that in one of my contentions later. Next, she talked about how the negative will warrant the ballot if I can prove that preventive war doesn't protect more often than not. Meaning that if citizens' lives aren't protected, that the negative ought to win the debate round. Or if citizens aren't protected by preventive war, then the affirmative has the ballot. Now I want to go over the first contention, that of protecting citizens. She brought up the Cuban Missile Crisis, and when I asked her whether the missiles were already sent, she said no, but the missiles were already in the United States' backyard, and that we speculated that with further time and with inaction, the threat would materialize. But keep in mind, the missiles were already in the United States' backyard. The missiles weren't there. That's not really a sense of inevitability, but more of an imminent threat. Whereas preventive war doesn't deal with imminent threats. That's what preemptive war does. And that's why there's such a big difference between the two concepts. So the application of the Cuban Missile Crisis is rather untopical since it talks about preemptive wars and not addressing preventive wars. Next, I asked her, is there a guarantee that threat will materialize? And she said there's no guarantee, but then again, nothing in life is a guarantee. Next, she talks about how action protects. And really this word protects is a little bit of a conundrum in my opinion. Because governments may try to protect people, but that doesn't mean that the people have the protection that they need. Because the word protect is a verb and a noun. And I'll talk about that a little later in my speech. But I want to go over several of my contentions as to why preventive war ought to be deemed unethical. First, you can tag this as cannot achieve government's purpose. Cannot achieve government's purpose. Well, my opponent and I agree that government's purpose is to protect its citizens. But preventive war cannot uphold government's moral duty, and because of that, it is unethical. And to further iterate, I want to bring up subpoint 1. Preventive wars are hypothetical. Preventive wars are hypothetical. All preventive wars, whether they end good or bad, are completely hinged on speculation. Governments wage this type of war on a threat that might never materialize, and the speculation is purely observational. There isn't a quantifiable shred of evidence that can support waging this war. Application 1 puts it best, the 2003 Iraq War. In 2003, the Bush administration went through with a controversial decision to initiate preventive war on Iraq. The intention of this attack was to derail Iraq's weapons of mass destruction program, since speculation of further nuclear world domination from Iraq was strong. We also feared the program was linked to Al-Qaeda, a terrorist group. However, upon attack, the nuclear weapons we feared weren't found, and there were also no links of collaboration with Al-Qaeda. And in return for delivering this faulty war, our nation lost more than 4,000 soldiers. In failing to execute, our national reputation took a hit. And the war as a whole cost us $1 trillion in various expenses during the 8 years. And the worst case about this war, we put a target on our backs with Iraq. And now we're a threat to them, and we're on their radar. And because of that, we now have to be watchful because of our action that we dealt with preventive war. Next, subpoint 2, preventive wars welcome greater threats. Preventive wars welcome greater threats. The perception of preventive wars is that it will end in a positive result. We can see this perception to be debunked by my last contention. And to make matters worse, not only do preventive wars fail to succeed in protection, they do succeed in something, potentially bringing in greater threats. Even if the initial plan of enemy damage succeeds, expect a retaliation attack. Because really, that's the nature of both humans and governments, and really that's the most logical scenario for the government that received preventive war to do, a retaliation attack. And that leads me to application 2, Pearl Harbor. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor as an act of preventive measure. This tragic event killed more than 2,000 Americans, and our naval troops were significantly damaged. The Japanese government deemed it ethical, as they feared we would be able to interfere with Japan's main mission of South Pacific conquest. However, this only led President Roosevelt to declare war on the Japanese one day later, and this soon bounced the United States into the background of World War II. Now, World War III didn't end well for Japan, as they were on the receiving end of 2 atomic bombs sent from, guess where? The United States. And that killed millions of the people the Japanese government wanted to protect. Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor was deemed ethical by their government, but in turn, the act only jump-started a domino effect of disaster. Attention to precedent set. Precedent set. With an affirmative ballot, any government can now wage an act of preventive war regardless of the intent. This is now dangerous because governments are given the thumbs up to use this tactic in order to bully neighboring countries into submission. Secondly, the act of preventive war loses its element of surprise. One reason why it can be effective at times is because the receiving end is unaware of any attack. But now with an affirmative ballot, all countries get to use it when they want, so the surprise element has somewhat been diminished. Preventive war has noble intentions, to protect citizens, but due to its hypothetical and violent nature, it fails to deliver in its results. Sure.
Hi Jason, congratulations again to getting to semifinals. Correct me if I'm wrong, but you knew that I was going to come up and cross-examine you right now, right?
Correct.
Okay, how sure were you? Can you give me a number?
100% because it's a debate round and that's really the next speech.
Okay, so it is possible that a communications woman could have come running in and said there was a fire, correct?
Yeah, I guess so. It's a rare scenario, but yes.
Okay, so you weren't necessarily 100% sure, but you were pretty sure that I was going to cross-examine you, correct?
Again, unless a miracle happened, this cross-examination was supposed to happen.
Okay, so, but you would agree that there is no 100% certainty until something happens, correct?
Right, there's no guarantee that anything will happen.
Okay. All right, so you've debated team policy before, haven't you?
I did, just casually.
Okay. So you would agree that with the affirmative and negative, the affirmative presents a plan and the negative points out the problems with the plan, correct?
I mean, this is more a Lincoln Douglas value debate round. So
I know, I do have somewhere I'm going with this.
Okay.
So you would agree that the negative usually manages to point down a downside to no matter how good a plan is, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so you would agree that negative doesn't win every round, correct?
Yeah. I would say so.
Okay, so and sometimes the judge chooses to vote affirmative because they avoid the risks?
Again, like we have things with voting issues and other things that the judge has in order to debate who wins the round.
Okay,
So, yeah.
okay. So did you give any specific examples as to how preventive war actually endangers citizens?
Again, like I talked about Pearl Harbor with Japan, their first act of preventive war ended up leading to the loss of protection of citizens.
So you would agree with me that Japan was one of the antagonists in World War II, correct?
In World War II, yes, and in
Yes.
the event of Pearl Harbor also.
All right, and you would agree that they were the ones who were in fact attacking other countries, correct?
Right, they attacked the United States as an act of preventive measure, but kind of backfired.
All right, but you would agree that they were involved in a war before that, correct?
That doesn't mean that the Pearl Harbor attack wasn't a preventive war. Countries might go on multiple wars, have one of them being preventive, another war being just a regular reactionary
Okay, so
war.
you would agree that if Japan had not actually gone to war in the first place, they would not have used that preventive measure against the United States, correct?
Which war?
If they had not gone into World War II, they would not have bombed Pearl Harbor. You can agree with me, right?
Again, they bombed Pearl Harbor to make sure that we wouldn't be an interference in their main mission of South Pacific conquest,
Okay.
rather unrelated to.
And was their mission of South Pacific conquest to protect their citizens or to conquest the South Pacific?
Again, I don't really know the mindset of the Japanese government and what their intent was in doing so I can't really give you a fair answer for that.
All right, thank you. No further questions. Quote, better 1,000 times err on the side of over-readiness to fight than err on the side of submission to injury or cold-blooded indifference to the misery of the oppressed. This was Theodore Roosevelt who said this, and it's because that I agree with Theodore Roosevelt that we cannot let innocent lives be endangered, and government has a job to protect its citizens, that I still stand with the resolution today: preventive war is ethical. In this speech, I'd just like to go over a few of my opponent's arguments and show why, in the end, I still stand with the resolution today. Let's first look at one of the first arguments he made, which was that of my application about the Cuban Missile Crisis. He said that this was, in fact, preemptive war. However, I would disagree with that. As I read multiple times, we had no surety that they were going to attack us in the near future. I said this several times, where President Kennedy had no surety that they would attack in the distant future. He simply knew that there were weapons nearby and it was endangering our citizens. And that was something that he felt was unethical. And I believe that because of that, my application still does stand. But I'd like to look at a couple of other of his arguments. First of all, he said that preventive war does not protect citizens. And he brought up the example of Pearl Harbor. Now, I'd like to address this for just a minute. Let's look at the example of Pearl Harbor specifically. Now, what happened in Pearl Harbor was actually because the Japanese were not trying to protect their citizens. What they were trying to do was save themselves from the threat of the United States coming in and blocking them from their conquest. What they were doing is they were being the aggressors. This was in no way a preventive war. What this was the Japanese invading another country and then realizing that, oh, some other countries might not be okay with this. Well, we should probably bomb them. Well, see, that's not protection of citizens. That is not the preventive war that we're talking about today. We're talking about a preventive war that is a war that a government fights because it believes its citizens were in danger. That is not what Japan was doing. Japan was fighting this war in order to stop the United States from stopping their own aggression. And that is not the preventive war that we are talking about today. If they are the main aggressors in the first place, then it cannot be a preventive war. Now, let's talk a little bit about how he said preventive wars are hypothetical. And I was a little bit confused by this argument, but I believe what he was saying is that we can't have surety that they will happen. And I would agree. We can't have surety that anything will happen. As my opponent agreed in cross-examination, we were pretty sure that I would come up and cross-examine him, but it's possible that anything could have happened. Something else could have happened. Obviously, we have no surety that anything will happen before it actually happens itself. But that does not mean that we should not do anything because we aren't sure it will happen. No, that does not mean doing something before it happens is unethical. Because if we have a reasonable suspicion that something will happen, then we can protect our citizens. Finally, he gave the example of Iraq, and my response to this is that it was not an example of preventive war because there had already been terrorists, and the United States had already been attacked by citizens of Iraq. And thus, this was simply a response to the attacks from Iraq themselves. This was a response, not a preventive war. And it is because, in the end, I believe that my opponent has not shown how preventive war has not protected citizens, how I have been able to show that preventive war does indeed protect citizens, that I believe I have upheld the value of today's round, that of protection of citizens. And I would ask that you would stand with the affirmative side of the resolution today. Thank you.
Yeah, Koryn?
Yes.
Awesome. Let's get started. In today's negative rebuttal, I want to go over really the main points of today's debate, refuting my opponent's points and also presenting some of my points that I talked about earlier in my negative constructive. And in the end, I'll tie the debate down to several voting issues. These voting issues are things that you should look for when it comes down to deciding who gets the final ballot. My opponent spent most of her first affirmative rebuttal refuting mine, so I'll refute the refutations. She talked about the Cuban Missile Crisis and my response to it, talking about the fact that indeed there was no certainty of threat. My response to this is still it is a preemptive war. She talked about how the missiles were right there in plain sight. It was in Cuba. It was in the United States backyard. And because of that, the threat was imminent. It was pretty much up close, and it was going to attack the United States pretty much any second. And yeah, sure, you can also say it was inevitable because those two terms are mutually exclusive on one side, but really that's categorized more as a preemptive war. Next, she talked about how Pearl Harbor was not a preventive war because the intent was conquest. And I'll bring this down to one of my voting issues, but my response right now is that it fits the definition of preventive war. It was a war initiated in the belief that military conflict from the United States was not imminent, but inevitable, and that to delay would involve greater risk. And really, that doesn't fit the value of protection of citizens, which is her end goal. We see that preventive war in that case was not used for the protection of citizens, and really it didn't achieve the protection of citizens. The intent of preventive war was flawed. And keep in mind, with an affirmative ballot, all governments get to use preventive war when they want to, regardless of the intent. So we're going, like with an affirmative ballot, multiple other Pearl Harbor-esque accidents can occur. Next, she talked about my argument hypothetical, and she talked about how nothing is guaranteed and a crazy scenario if a fire came in and all that. My response to it is that preventive war is a substantial action. Again, nothing is guaranteed. It's not guaranteed that my Seahawks will win tomorrow, but then again, that's not really substantial. Or there's no guarantee that I can get a certain amount of speaker points, but it isn't really substantial at the end, like in the big picture. But preventive war is a substantial action because it seeks to protect citizens, but sadly, it cannot deliver in doing such. Next, she talked about my example on the 2003 Iraq War and how she talks about how it is not a preventive war. My response to this is the same as Pearl Harbor. It still is. We look at the intent of the preventive war from the Iraq War was for us to derail Israel's weapons of mass destruction program. We feared that the threat of the weapons of mass destruction program was inevitable and that delaying would almost elicit greater risk in the sense that Iraq might have attacked us. Because of that, it fits perfectly into the definition of preventive war both my opponent and I agree upon, and we see from the preventive war that was waged in Iraq that it cost money, it cost lives, and it didn't really protect our citizens. It only pretty much put a target on their backs. Now, I want to go over several voting issues. Voting issue number one is, again, governmental abuse. Like I talked about earlier with Japan and Pearl Harbor, and how Japan, the Japanese government, used Pearl Harbor as an act of preventive war in order to feed their conquest agenda. And we see that with an affirmative ballot, all governments get to use preventive war regardless of the intent, regardless of the pure intent that it was set out to be, to protect citizens. But now, governments can use it for conquest, can use it for bullying tactics, can use it for other things that end up not protecting citizens. But now, my second voting issue, you can tag as unsolvent. See, and I'm going to use Pearl Harbor again. They thought they succeeded in, damaging our troops and our land, and they did. But in the end, it only caused a response attack from us that ended up bouncing us into World War II, and we all know what happened in World War II to Japan. So not only did they not succeed in their conquest, but also a lot of their people were sadly killed, which is a really terrible predicament. And at the end of the day, preventive war did not solve governmental purpose. Next, I want to look at the inherent nature of preventive war. Voting issue number 3, inherent nature. Both my opponent and I agree that preventive war is an act of violence. And really, what's the human nature in responding to violence with more violence? See, if preventive war is used to the purest of intents at all times, even if it was that, and even if we didn't have the problem of wrong intent, we see that it still isn't solvent. The Iraq War caused us to have a target on our backs. Pearl Harbor caused their citizens to just sadly be eradicated by nuclear bombs. We see that since we are humans, since governments are humans as well, the only way we respond to violence is with more violence. And that is not protection of citizens. Lastly, I want to go over something about precedent setting. Professor Stephen Nathanson from Notre Dame talked about how we are on balance better off not allowing preventive force at all, because preventive force may be launched against threats that will never materialize, he says. He also states that history shows a permissive doctrine of preventive war leads to more wars, many of them unnecessary. We see that preventive war is almost like poking a bear in the cave. We try to kill the bear, but if we don't succeed, the bear is going to be 10 times as angrier. And although preventive war has noble intents to protect citizens, we see that the nature is both hypothetical and violent. And that only leads to more violence, not the protection of citizens.
I have 1 minute and 40 seconds of wars have been brought up. The Cuban Missile Crisis Pearl Harbor, and the war in Iraq. And in this speech, I'd just like to go over these three main examples and show you why in the end they either do not apply or still support the affirmative side, and finally give you two major voting issues. Now, first let's talk a little bit about Cuba. Now, my opponent said that it's preemptive war because they were going to do it. Now, we had no reason to believe that they were 100% going to attack us the next day. That is not what we knew. What we knew was that there was a possibility that they would attack us. We had no surety. Preemptive war is basically the difference in surety, and we had no surety that they were going to do it. However, there was a significant possibility. Thus, the example of the Cuban Missile Crisis should still be considered an example of preventive war, a war in which it was ethical to take a preventive measure. Let's talk a little bit about Pearl Harbor. Now, my problem with this example is that Japan was being the aggressor in the first place. They were not protecting their citizens. Now, the main duty of a government is to protect its citizens. If it goes to war or takes any action for any other reason against another country, it is not doing its job. If a government doesn't do its job, it is not a legitimate government. It is not a legitimate government. And a government that is not protecting its citizens cannot do anything ethically. And because of this, I would believe that the example of Pearl Harbor does not apply, because it was an example of a government going in and being the aggressors in the first place. Japan was going in and being the aggressor in the first place. They were not protecting their citizens. Preventive war is protecting citizens. Now, my opponent said that my definition simply says greater risk. Now, I would say that because what we're talking about is risk to a country, and because the only risk to a country can be the protection of the citizens, if a country is not acting in the protection of citizens, then the country is not a legitimate government and therefore is not doing it correctly. Now, finally, I would like to look at the issue of Iraq. The Iraq War was not an example of preventive war. Why? Because Iraq's citizens had already attacked us first. It was, instead, a measure of defense. It was not a preventive war. So finally, I'd like to look at my two major voting issues. The first is that war is changing. This is an argument I brought up in my first speech, and it went unresponded to by my opponent. We are living in an age of nuclear weapons and chemical weapons, and citizens are endangered far earlier than they ever have been in the past. And I do not believe that that is something the government should stand by. And the second is that protection of its citizens. And this goes with his last voting issue, in which it is in the inherent nature of war. But even if there are risks, it is still moral to do what is right. Thank you.